but royal directives were often ignored by the powerful aristocratic landowners who resented any interference on their property. Tax cadastres, like those in Piedmont, generally do not exist, and this makes research more difficult.
There are, for example, no land records, no land maps. A lot of the land registries were actually destroyed in riots and revolutions in the course of the 19th century. So that when I first went to Sicily, it was actually very difficult, and I had to change slightly what I was trying to work on. I had wanted to work on peasant life and peasant society in the 19th century, but that was really impossible. What I ended up having to do was looking at peasant society through the eyes of political administrators and through the eyes of the police, which gives you a slightly distorted view of peasant society in 19th century Sicily.
You also get a distorted image of Sicily if you let your view of the place be dominated by the secret society which has been so significant in its history since the middle of the 19th century, or by the mass poverty and mass emigration at the end. All the evidence that we have for Sicily at the beginning of the 19th century shows it to have been agriculturally a very rich island, exporting to countries across Europe. For centuries, the main wealth had depended on grain produced on vast estates called latifondi, which covered the centre of the island in often remote and mountainous regions. These great estates belonged either to the nobility or to the still powerful feudal church with its monastic religious orders. At the beginning of the 19th century, the agricultural economy of Sicily was on the brink of change.
Nel corso dell'Ottocento il grano riduce la sua importanza, non solo in termini di quantità, ma anche perché la cresciuta popolazione interna della Sicilia fa sì che il frumento prodotto a stento sia sufficiente per l'alimentazione della popolazione. Dunque la Sicilia non esporta più grano nell'Ottocento, anzi l'importa. La produzione di grano è concentrata soprattutto nella Sicilia interna, nelle province di Caltanissetta, laddove ci sono anche le miniere di zolfo. Le miniere di zolfo producono una materia prima di cui la Sicilia ha il monopolio su scala mondiale e lo zolfo, come sappiamo, è importantissimo per la fabbricazione della soda e dell'acido solforico, prodotti fondamentali della giovane industria chimica che si sviluppa in Francia e in Inghilterra agli inizi dell'Ottocento.
Another source of Sicily's wealth was the vineyards around Marsala on the southwest coast. These had also developed strong English connections in the late 18th century with the arrival of several entrepreneurs. Benjamin Ingham, for example, originally a textile manufacturer from Leeds, built these wine warehouses, and with them, a very lucrative trade. This in turn led to a massive expansion of vine cultivation inland. Another luxury crop exported to the markets of Northern Europe were the oranges and lemons from the citrus groves around the capital, Palermo, and on the east coast, under the shadow of Mount Etna, on the plain of Catania. During the 19th century, the acreage given over to citrus orchards increased almost 12-fold. The growing populations of Northern Europe had an insatiable appetite for these rare imported goods. So much for the fruits of Sicilian agricultural production. But what about the people who worked on the land? Where did they live? What was the structure of their society? Now, you may assume that people who work the land live on farms or in small villages, but assumptions can be extremely dangerous. One way that historians have of penetrating rural societies is to look at their pattern of settlement, and then you can come up with some real surprises.
In Sicily, the rural workers tended to live concentrated into what are called agro-towns, that is large, often very densely populated, even overpopulated urban settlements. These agro-towns still exist and often, at least from a distance, look very similar to how they looked in the 19th century.
Because there had been a series of civil wars, and because the lowland areas that were more arable were subject to malaria, these communities tended to be clustered on hillsides and fairly densely settled, highly nucleated towns, ranging in size from, well, the smallest must have been around 2,000 or 3,000, but the modal size would have been 5,000 to 10,000 population, and some were as large as 40,000 or 50,000. But they were all agro-towns, agricultural communities in which some 60 to 70% of the adult male population was engaged in agriculture. They lived in these hillside towns and went out to their fields on a daily basis. Very few people, only some shepherds, actually lived in the countryside for any extended period of time.
Travelling to and from the fields to work on foot could take 2 or 3 hours each way. So at busy times of the year, such as sowing and harvesting, groups of labourers often stayed overnight in the fields or in remote semi-fortified outposts called masseria.
It's a very interesting feature of Sicily, this absence of rural dwellers in the countryside. I think more than anything it probably reflects the fact that the countryside was at least considered to be a very dangerous place. It was considered to be a dangerous place, one, because of bandits who at any moment might attack someone in the countryside. Whether this was in fact the case or not is less important than it was perceived to be a problem. And secondly, because the countryside was actually associated with disease, and particularly it was associated with malaria. And so there was a feeling that the countryside was much more of a dangerous place than the towns, and the towns were a safe place to live. So the towns in that sense are almost like fortresses.
The architecture of these towns often still reflects the social structure of the 19th century. Here, dominating the town of Leonforte, is the Palace of Branciforte, built for the Prince of Butera, the great landowning aristocrat of this region. Although he held feudal title to most of the town and surrounding land, and drew enormous wealth and revenue from it, he would seldom visit more than once a year, spending most of his time in Palermo or Naples.
Since the aristocrats weren't there in person, their affairs were looked after by administrators and very often by renters, middlemen who would rent large portions of the feudal estate and administer the state as if they owned it on behalf of the feudal lord. And they gradually, over the decades in the 19th century, were able to accumulate their own wealth, their own land, their own animals, sometimes at the expense of the peasants, sometimes at the expense of the feudal lords who they served. So they were, even in the early part of the century, beginning to be a rising social class in their own right.
These estate administrators, or middlemen, known as gabelotti or rent collectors, were to play an increasingly important role in Sicilian society as the 19th century progressed. But the overwhelming majority of the people who lived in the agro towns were the so-called peasants. A few of the wealthiest were smallholders who owned their own houses and enough land to feed their families. Usually they had a 2-story house with storerooms and maybe a stable for the mule on which they rode to the fields. Much more numerous were the sharecroppers and day labourers who had to rent their much smaller houses, often ramshackle and poorly built, so very few survive. If they could afford a mule, they often shared the space with the animal.
In the wine and orchard regions, outside of the latifundist grain-producing interior, there was a different social hierarchy. There were more affluent smallholders, small peasant proprietors, who produced these luxury crops, if you will, for market. So the social hierarchy was more even, less polarized. In the sulfur mining regions in the early part of the century, there's a mix of agriculture and sulfur mining. They coexist side by side, and the mines are located often in the same places as the feudal estates and are owned by the aristocratic families that control the estates. But the sulfur miners were, as a category, quite distinct from the peasants. Even though some peasant children might become apprenticed to the sulfur miners, they were surprisingly, although we have this image of the terrible poverty and terrible working conditions in the mines, they were wealthier than the peasants. They had a greater average annual income. They ate better. They ate meat more often than the poor peasants. And so there was an additional category there in the sulfur mining regions.
These notoriously polluting sulfur mines underline the fact that the economy in rural areas did not depend solely on agriculture. But agriculture depends on the weather and the seasons. And this is what controlled the lives of the people who depended upon the land for survival, who found a purpose for and knew the value of whatever that land produced. In this case, forage for feeding animals. In Sicily, there are said to be two seasons, a wet winter and spring, which produces verdant pasture and germinates grain. This gives way to a fiercely hot summer. In social terms, each season was punctuated by a specific festival, accommodated by the church calendar. Each town celebrated their festivals differently. Here in Prizzi, in the latifondist interior, the Easter or springtime festival still maintains its position in the community as a highlight of the year. Whatever the origins of such springtime festivities, in the 19th century, as today, they offered an opportunity for extended families to take time off work, enjoy themselves, and renew their loyalties.
The agricultural year, speaking of the latifundist interior, reflects the planting and harvesting of the grain crop, but it also reflects the movement of animals. Because the animals are pastured according to a transhumant schedule, which means that they move from the high mountains to the lower elevations in the course of the year, you have to think about what that was like, this vast movement of animals. And one interesting moment in the agricultural calendar occurs after the harvest. The harvest is always done by sickle, even when in Northern Europe scythes start to be used. And scythes are, of course, much more efficient. The sickle takes longer. But the reason that in Sicily the sickle remains in place is that when you harvest with a sickle, the stubble is left behind. The sickle doesn't cut as low to the ground. So after the harvest, an excellent thing to do is to bring these herds of animals onto the stubble, let them graze the stubble and drop their manure as they're doing it. And so the harvest then was always followed by this entry of the animals. One must appreciate at the same time that there are no fences in this countryside. Nothing is closed. The fields can't be closed. It wouldn't make sense to close them. But because they're not closed, there's always the possibility that these animals are going to get into those fields before they're harvested and eat some of the crop as well as the stubble.
Animals straying onto growing crops caused constant tension in land use, which often led to violence between the agriculturalists and the pastoralists. There was also strife when landowners commandeered common land for grain cultivation, thus depriving peasants of grazing for their animals. This led to landowners and their estate administrators using strong-armed men to protect their land and to use violence to discipline the labor force. To the landowners who employed them, they were armed security guards, but in police records, they were often described as bandits, and with good cause.
They tend to be peasants, often dispossessed peasants, but will often return from being a bandit or from being a strong-armed man to then take up the life of an ordinary rural worker. This is actually a major problem for the government in Sicily before unification and indeed afterwards, because it means that bandits are extremely difficult to identify. They're not bandits all the time. Sometimes they're bandits, sometimes they're strong-armed men working for a landowner, and sometimes they're just an ordinary peasant working in the fields.
In Piedmont, and specifically here in the Langhe, there had also been bandits in the 18th century. These bandits were smugglers, and they used the thick local woods and local mists as cover for their activities, as they drove fat Piedmontese cattle south to Genoa and brought back salt. In the early 19th century, the French occupied the whole of northern Italy, and they dissolved the old political and trade frontiers, which had made smuggling so profitable. The French also introduced an effective new police force, the gendarmerie. Together, these destroyed banditry in Piedmont, and it never returned. But the countryside, the hills and valleys, which had hidden the local bandit smugglers, also fostered its own kind of rural society and its own kind of rural settlement.
L'insediamento della regione delle Langhe ha due forme caratteristiche, presenta due tipi insediativi caratteristici. Quello che probabilmente colpisce di più chi visita le Langhe per la prima volta sono i villaggi, piccoli villaggi, collocati generalmente in cima ai colli, spesso attorno ad un castello, il castello dell'antica famiglia a cui era infeudato il borgo. Certamente queste forme di insediamento accentrato, annucleato in villaggi di sommità, costituisce la caratteristica fondante. Però non è solo questo l'insediamento langarolo. L'insediamento disperso, la casa rurale, è spesso molto semplice, ha una tipologia semplicissima, che è la cosiddetta cassina alla piemontese, che è una casa che assomiglia in parte alla longhouse anglosassone, e cioè è un edificio a pianta rettangolare, semplicissima, in cui esiste una stanza per l'abitazione della famiglia contadina che abita la casa, e poi accanto una stalla e sovrammessa alla stalla un fienile.
The question is, how was this rural society structured, given that the population of the Langhe inhabited both the countryside and the towns?
At the top were the feudal barons. They lost their political powers under Napoleon, and these feudal rights to judge people, to police their own territories, were never restored to them. But economic power and social prestige were always with them, right up to the early 20th century, in fact. Below them were the feudal agents who, after Napoleon abolished feudalism, continued as estate managers. Many of them also attached to the legal professions. They were lawyers as well as estate managers. They were also government civil servants. They also composed most of the middling ranks of the clergy. These were the kind of people who controlled the small towns of the Langhe. Below them, we call the class the peasantry, but as we know, the peasantry is a very, very complex animal. At the top, you have quite wealthy peasants. All leaseholders, very few peasants actually owned their own land outright, but holders of substantial farms, very close to this rural bourgeoisie who were the agents of the nobility.
Below them is what in Italian is called the mesadria, generally small tenant farmers who lived on what they grew. By the beginning of the 19th century, increasing rents forced the poorest of the mesadria into the ranks of day labourers. Those who could afford to survived by expanding their holdings into more profitable farms. By the end of the 19th century, this class of mesadria in the Langhe had become the backbone of Piedmontese rural society.
At the bottom of the rural hierarchy are the braccianti. These are day laborers. These are people who don't own land or who own very little. They're becoming less numerous in the Langhe, particularly as the century progresses. But in areas of more commercialized farming, like the Vercellese, they form almost the entire rural population.
Il Vercellese è una delle aree che in Piemonte per prima lascia questo modello di policoltura che è proprio delle agricolture d'antico regime per lanciarsi una vera e propria monocoltura e quindi di un'agricoltura di mercato. La grande proprietà fondiaria che caratterizza il Vercellese definisce anche dei modelli insediativi propri, particolari, che sono la cascina, la cassina della grande proprietà fondiaria. Generalmente, non sempre, ma diciamo che la tipologia più diffusa è quella della cosiddetta cascina a corte chiusa, e cioè un enorme, grande quadrilatero in cui coesistono nello stesso spazio all'interno, si affacciano cioè su uno spiazzo interno spesso di grosse dimensioni, 4 ali, 4 braccia di edifici che ospitano tutti gli edifici rurali, compresi quelli specializzati per la trattazione del riso, quindi la pila da riso, il mulino da riso, la parte dell'edificio destinata alla brillatura del riso, e anche quella destinata ad ospitare tutto quel bracciantato rurale, quei contadini senza terra di cui stagionalmente la grande azienda risicola si deve servire per la raccolta del riso o per ripulire le risaie dalle erbacce.
Well over 100 people would have lived and worked on a large holding. It was labor-intensive, back-breaking work, which only began to be mechanized in the middle of the 20th century.
Rice was a profitable crop. The landowners of the area, be they noble, bourgeois, even the church, saw the profitability of this. And in the course of the 18th century, destroyed mezzadria in this area to replace it with these large rice fields, which were frankly malarial. The population of the Vercellese crashed by the early 19th century. Very few peasants lived there permanently. Most of those who did were landless laborers who worked the rice fields. It is a remarkable story of human suffering. It appalled successive governments, the Piedmontese princes in the 18th century, the Napoleonic officials, and the restored Piedmontese government afterwards. Nobody could do very much to curb it because it was so profitable. The social hierarchy, as a result, is very simple. You have a few large landowners. You have the rural bourgeoisie, who are their middlemen, and increasingly landowners in their own right. You have a few large farmers who manage the land for them. And then you have a mass of landless laborers, most of whom come from outside the area. But those who remained are remarkable for their ill health. One of the most interesting sources, one of the most disturbing sources we have on this subject are actually the reports of Napoleonic conscription officers. Because when the French sergeant majors went into the rice fields of the Vercellese to try and find men for the French army, they found very few recruits. Most of them were malarial, consumptive. Almost everyone had rickets and was unfit for military service. And if you're looking for hard documentary evidence of what the health and the daily life and sufferings of the peasantry was like in this area, you'll find it in these conscription reports of the Napoleonic period. The social base, such as it was among the most miserable in Western Europe.
Misery, of course, is always difficult to quantify. For most agricultural labourers in the middle of the 19th century, life was always hard, and it often seems to have been pretty miserable. Politically, they had no voice, and as far as the state was concerned, they were really only relevant as providers of taxes and sometimes as conscripts. So, taken together in the middle of the 19th century, Piedmont and Sicily have social structures that in many respects are similar, but their agricultural systems and their patterns of settlement differ widely. And of course, in the middle of the 19th century, Piedmont and Sicily are quite different countries. In 1859, the Piedmontese monarchy set about the task of unifying Italy. Not surprisingly, landless labourers didn't figure on its list of priorities. But much to its embarrassment, at precisely that moment, the maverick patriot Giuseppe Garibaldi decided to launch his own expedition to liberate Sicily from the Bourbon monarchy. And Garibaldi was fully prepared to use the people to do this. The question is, what were the people's expectations of unification?
It actually can be said in one word, which is land. When Garibaldi arrived in Sicily in 1860, he promised land to the Sicilian peasants, and this was essentially what they expected from Italian unification. They didn't get it, and were very disappointed as a result. And a lot of the resentment felt by peasants towards the Italian government can be attributed to the disappointment of these expectations.
The expectations, sadly, were not met. There are a number of reasons for this, but we could focus on one important reason, which is that by the time we get to unification, there is in the making a new class of large landholders. I think it makes sense to think of them as a gentry class. They were not titled nobility. They were up-and-coming landowners. Many of them originated as estate administrators in the earlier part of the century. The renters who took large amounts of property in rent and then subdivided it among the peasants. And this new class was very hungry, almost one could say greedy for land at the time of unification. Their big opportunity came in the late 1860s when there did finally happen in Sicily this process of expropriating the lands of the church. And these ecclesiastical lands are taken over by the state and then divided and sold at auction. And the state had the intent of dividing the land into rather small, modest parcels and ensuring that it would end up in the hands of small, modest peasants. In fact, the auctions tended to be dominated by this rising group of gentry, and they ended up with the lion's share of the new ecclesiastical properties.
These new men, who increasingly displaced the aristocracy, not only built themselves grand houses in the agro-towns in emulation of the aristocrats, but often chose the style of Tuscan palaces, the architecture of northern Italy.
What we see after unification is more and more new men becoming mayors, becoming councillors, becoming captains of the National Guard, becoming tax collectors, and becoming policemen. In this sense, the new men are representatives of the state. They use the political power which is given to them by the state to increase their wealth and to increase their hold over rural communities. Peasants were deeply resentful of the situation as regards land and would often actually become involved in rioting against the landowners and against the land offices to protest against the usurpation of common land, as it's called, or simply to protest against high taxation, in essentially to express their grievances against the landowners for the economic conditions that they were suffering. This violence on the part of peasants was often actually encouraged, however, by members of the elite. And in order to understand why this takes place, one has to have an appreciation of the second kind of violence, which occurs in rural communities in 19th century Sicily. And this is a kind of factional violence. A factional violence between rival groups of elites and a factional violence which is often centered on control of the communal administration.
Factionalism in Sicily was not between political parties as such, but between rival groups invariably centered on a family. The families were intent on gaining or maintaining local power and patronage, and for them, family was always far more important than any loyalty to a distant state. But the newly unified Italian state was far more efficient than any of its predecessors, much more difficult to avoid. It made new demands, such as conscription, which struck at the very heart of traditional loyalties like family and community, with dire consequences.
Sicily had traditionally been exempt from conscription. The idea of the Italian government, of course, by introducing conscription to Sicily, was to make Sicilians into Italians. That was the idea. If anything, it was to have the reverse effect.
The very first years after unification were terrible for Sicily. Imposition of new taxes, of conscription, the elimination of tariff barriers that undermined local industries. It was a very difficult period, and it culminated in an uprising in Palermo and a brigand war in the countryside. So that by the end of the 1860s, the new nation state of Italy is prepared to alter some of its policies toward the island and to make some investments in the island. And two areas of investment were crucial. One was education, and the other was transportation, the construction of a network of roads and railroads.
But these advances came at just the moment when new competition precipitated a massive agricultural crisis.
The most telling point in all of this is where American grain, produced now using machinery, enters European markets, and in the 1880s causes a collapse of grain prices. That collapse is devastating for Sicily. It undermines much of the development in the latifundist interior. And the crisis that comes in the 80s and early 1890s is devastating for the rural population. And it's in that context that the massive migration to the United States and other parts of the New World begins.
Many immigrants prospered in the Italian communities of New York and other American cities. Their departure from Sicily began to ease the pressure on land, and many were able to send back money to alleviate the economic and social problems that they'd left behind. But in Sicily, the economic problems didn't go away. In the 1890s, they gave rise to a movement known as the Sicilian Fasci, a unique mixture of apocalyptic Catholicism, socialism, and a good old splash of Sicilian violence. The riots and repression which followed led still more Sicilians to seek their fortune elsewhere. Here in Piedmont, in contrast, society was much more peaceful. The effects of a nationwide economic crisis were not felt as severely. Piedmont had responded much more readily to unification. There had been serious and successful attempts to modernize agriculture. Here in the Langhe, for example, the larger landowners and the mezzadri had sought to capitalize on the distinctive qualities of their local grapes.
The real break point for the Piedmontese economy, particularly in the countryside, came in the 1850s, the decade before unification. The Piedmontese call this il periodo cavouriano. They also call it the miracle decade. This was the period when the Piedmontese economy really took off. That's not to say that it changed, at least in the countryside. It improved. It got richer. Probably the most important thing that came to change the Piedmontese economy was the railway. At a time when most other Italian states were dragging their feet about creating a modern infrastructure, if you like, the Piedmontese government under Cavour pushed forward. The country became covered with small railway lines, just like everywhere else in Northern Europe. And what this meant for the peasantry of areas like the Langhe was that they were able to move away from a subsistence agriculture bent on simply maintaining their own way of life, to be able to develop the more profitable aspects of that mixed agriculture. In the case of the Langhe, that meant winemaking, that meant grapes. It didn't happen overnight. It was only really by the 1880s that Piedmontese wine as we know it today became a luxury product well known all over Europe. But this period of just about a generation sees the peasantry of the Langhe move from being mezzadri towards being specialist producers of a specialist product that's brought the region fame, renown, and no small amount of hard cash. The picture of life in the Vercellese is a much glummer one. In the space of a few miles that separates the two regions, the Langhe and the Vercellese, you pass into a different world. There was still a landless peasantry. It was still plagued by malaria. It was still hard-worked and overburdened. None of this alters in the course of the 19th century. It was a peasantry immune from any outside influences, immune to the great political changes that were sweeping Italy, such as unification, immune for a long time even to socialism and unionization, although by the early decades of the 20th century, this was beginning to alter. The peasantry of the Vercellese were poor, downtrodden, and miserable. They were still in thrall to the great landowners of the area. It's a story of economic success for the very few who benefited from it, but it's not matched by a story of social progress and evolution.
The changes which the 19th century witnessed affected each agricultural region of Europe differently. A point that's often forgotten or ignored is that rural societies are as complex and stratified as any urban industrial one. 19th century economic and political change meant inevitably that there were winners and losers. Subsistence agriculture was no longer enough. The losers inevitably were driven into day laboring or into emigration. For politicians and social commentators of the 19th century, as well as for many of the historians who have written about it, the century was about progress, about evolution, for some even about revolution. But these concepts would have meant little for the people who worked on the land, for whom the state was the tax collector or perhaps the recruiting sergeant. For them, the key question which they asked at the beginning of every year was, would the harvest succeed? But their horizons were widening. Better education, better communications, a spell in the national army, all served to turn some peasants into Italians, into Frenchmen, or whatever. But there were other peasants for whom these changes had the opposite effect, and Sicily would be a good example of this. For them, change didn't so much as widen their horizons as to turn them back onto what had always been important for them, community and family.